Welcome to Men Are Forged podcast. I'm your host, Cartwright Morris. If you're a young man trying to figure out that next step in life, trying to define and discover what your purpose is, then this podcast for you. I, like you, was in my mid-20s trying to figure out who I was and what I want to do with my life. And through learning from men that have gone before me of how they took massive action in their life, built strong mindsets, and defined their purpose, they stepped into more of who they are and found not only a purpose, but fulfillment in their life and excitement and lasting success that they now carry in the next phase of life. So go to menarforged.com to find out more. And thank you for listening. Today's episode's with Croft Edwards. Croft is a leadership coach and author of a book called LeadershipFlow, Perfectly Squared, a story about learning to lead and transforming a company. Me and Croft had a great discussion about his coaching practice and his uniqueness and how to help people unpack more of the things that motivate them and how to find that and apply that in their life, specifically into their business. So yeah, Croft, he's a retired Army officer. He was raised in the military, but he's also he's a military history buff too. So we kind of get into that, and it's really fun just to kind of pick his brain about some of this stuff because I'm very curious. I like history, specifically related to some of the wars, and so he was very interesting. But to talk about that, but we talk about his upbringing as well, just a lot of things that have happened in his life that have led him to this point that, now he wants to give back and help leaders in their space and what they're doing. So I hope you enjoy this interview. It's with Croft Edwards at CroftandCompany.com. That's CroftandCompany.com. So here's the interview. All right. Well, welcome into another episode of Men Are Forged podcast. Croft Edwards coming all the way from New Mexico. But if you're watching this on video, you'll notice that beautiful diploma over his right shoulder of the Auburn University. Well, War Eagle, Croft, and it's great to have you.
War Eagle. Great to be here.
So, I'm just curious real quick, before we really get in your story, Croft, what's, New Mexico this time of the year? What is some of the activities going on? What is kind of springtime look like in New Mexico?
Well, so for me, I consider myself a gentleman farmer. We have a small farm. So lots of planting and animal stuff. We have emus, and we just had some emus hatch, and there's chickens running around and other things growing on the farm. So other than right now, the wind and the fires, it's pretty typical spring, very windy, but the fires aren't near here. So it's pretty hazy. But the other thing is I just got a tractor. So pretty much spring involves me being on a tractor. So,
oh, wow.
That's what I do I'm
kind of jealous. So farming, you mean, so obviously you got the animals, but is it a certain type of vegetables you grow or?
No, we have about 3.5 acres, so it's really all just pasture. And then I do a lot of gardening, but more landscape type gardening, not so much growing vegetables. I have never been a vegetable person, so it's a lot of wasted energy to grow something I won't eat. So
That's great. And wildfires. I mean, I lived in California where it was kind of during a drought. And I know I hear them in Colorado. I mean, as a Southern person where there's water in the air, we don't have to deal with those. Is that a pretty common thing? Usually every year in New Mexico, there's some type of fire?
Yeah. And here, you're probably used to 60, 70% humidity. Mm-hmm. A typical day here, it's 20% humidity. So it's just super dry. A lot of wind. Now, I could say my joke of why it's so windy in New Mexico, but that involves why Texas sucks so much. But that's a whole other story, right? But so it's very windy, very dry. The good news is, up north, there's more stuff to burn. But it's just, it is what it is. It's ideal conditions for that. And, we're in a desert state and it's windy and it's dry. So.
Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful state that I've only driven through a couple of times that I'd really love to visit. So yeah, I'm really sorry. My curiosity sometimes takes over, and I get curious about people where they live.
I'm one of those people. I chose to come back to New Mexico, and we are 49th and 50th in a lot of categories, unfortunately. But there is an upside to that, is that we're not Arizona. Phoenix, it can take you 2 hours to get from one side to the other. In Albuquerque, still, I can get from where I live in the northwest part of Albuquerque to, down by the airport in 20, 25 minutes. And that's
right.
So we like that. And I love the fact that I can get in the car and I can literally be in the middle of nowhere in, 20, 30 minutes if I choose.
Yeah.
So there is something to be said for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Croft, let's just get in your story. So, I mean, you live in New what would you say you grew up? What state, what city?
So I grew up southern New Mexico. I lived in a small town called Deming, home of the world's richest duck race, which is about 30 miles from the Mexican border. Mm-hmm. And then my parents divorced when I was about 7, I guess, and we moved an hour away to Las Cruces. And so grew up there, and I grew up in New Mexico pretty much my whole life until I went off to college.
Yeah.
So, native New Mexican.
So what was maybe a more, sometimes I try to think memorable, or what was a life-changing moment that you experienced, especially in your adolescence, that you remember today that kind of changed your trajectory?
So for me, it actually, it kind of ties to the leadership story. So my parents had divorced. We moved to Las Cruces. My mom worked for a U.S. senator as a district manager for one of his districts. Yeah. And I was probably 8, maybe 9 years old. And it was during the summer. And she had an event out at Fort Bliss, which is in El Paso, which is about 45 minutes from Las Cruces. So I went with her. I don't remember why, there wasn't anything for me to do, whatever. So, but at this event, during the introductions, the announcer said, "Ladies and gentlemen, General of the Army, Omar Bradley." And I remember everybody just standing up because Bradley at the time lived at Fort Bliss. He was in his probably 80s, I would imagine. Actually, maybe even a little older. And they wheel in this older, frail gentleman in his uniform. And everybody just kind of stands up, and there's this clap that I remember being kind of a reverent, respectful clap, not like a cheer at a sports stadium, but rather just this respectful thing. And I just remember I didn't know who he was, but I was really interested in who is this man and why are people making a big deal of it. So on the way back, I asked my mom who he was. She said who he was, and I had her take me to the library. And I checked out his autobiography, which is called A Soldier's Story. And it's about 800 pages. And I was, like I said, I was 8 or 9 at the time. And I started reading it. And for whatever reason, it piqued in me this fundamental question that I've been studying ever since, which is, why was he, or any leader for that matter, successful? And so what is this thing called leadership? And as I learned more, here's Bradley, who at the start of the war, was with Patton, and then Patton became his boss. He was Patton's boss for a while, and then he became Patton's boss, and ended on being the last of the 5-star generals in the U.S. Army. But just very, very quiet person, very reserved. And how is it he could be successful? And then you have somebody like Patton, who was flamboyant and all of those things. And so that event actually kind of planted a seed that I've been studying ever since. And that was one of those, just happened to go see him speak.
Which, my dad is such a movie buff. And so he introduced me to the movie Patton, and Omar, the guy who played General Bradley, it was very much a key influence into Patton, who really reshaped the war. And so that's interesting. That was your catalyst to leadership and growth. So along the way, did that lead to then getting into the military at some point in your life? Was that kind of the beginning?
So then fast forward, my parents are divorced. My mom one night meets a at the time, active duty Army lieutenant colonel. There's a lot of military down by Las Cruces, White Sands Missile Range, Fort Bliss. And he was stationed there, and they ended up getting married. he was a Army colonel at the time. Had won the Silver Star in Vietnam, Army Ranger, West Pointer, just an amazing guy. Mm-hmm. And we had a little bit of a love-hate relationship because when my parents had been divorced, I lived with my mom and my two sisters. So de facto, I was the man of the house. I was in charge. And here comes this bald Army colonel telling me what I'm going to do. And I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to let him to do that. But he had other plans, and he kind of he kind of was like, no, we're going to do things a certain way. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't harsh. Like, he wasn't a tyrant. He was actually one of the most loving people I had ever met, but he just was so firm in his character and who he was. And he would say things, he could put things in perspective. Mm-hmm. Because he had been in combat in Vietnam and in very intense combat. Mm-hmm. And I asked him one time why he didn't stay, and he said, I just had missed too many bullets. And he went through Vietnam completely unscathed. He said his replacement a week later was killed. And so he had seen that. And I remember he had seen all this carnage. And then we had a puppy that we had got that drowned in our swimming pool. And I remember we had a little kind of a memorial in the backyard, and I saw him crying. And here was a guy that could see all of that harshness of the world, and yet he had such a passion for life, such a drive. So he was a very big influence on my life.
Yeah.
So then I decide, luckily, my mom and my stepdad were great influence. My dad was also, but he lived back an hour away, and so we didn't see him as much. And so went off to school at Michigan State because I just wanted to go somewhere and didn't want to go to the local college. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but I wanted to go see the world. Mm-hmm. And he actually chose to drive me to Michigan State, and we drove, 18, 24 hours straight, and He dropped me off. And I remember he shook my hand and said, I know you'll do well. And I thought at the time, I want to give him a hug, but I was like, no, I gotta, this is my moment. I'm off at college. Mm-hmm. And little did I know that 2 weeks later, he was going to be killed by a drunk driver. And so that was very, very shaking, because that was the first time I had ever experienced death. It was the first time I'd ever really experienced something like that. Mm. So I come home for the funeral, and I'm out in our backyard raking leaves. And all of a sudden, it was as if everything he had tried to teach me, I just got. It just came alive. And it was this moment of as close to bliss as I think I could have ever experienced. It was just like, oh. Mm-hmm. And I just was like, yeah, I get it. And so at that point I said, okay, I knew the type of man he was. So did Army ROTC and just said, yep, that's a path I want to go on. And then, so did that for 4 years, and then graduate. And a week later, I'm on active duty in the Army. So that's kind of how I got there. It was just, that tied with that idea of what is leadership. And, by then I was a pretty studious amateur historian. Mm-hmm. So I had a pretty, I'd read a lot on World War II and the Civil War. So I had already started expanding my knowledge of military history and all of those things. And so then the Army was an easy path to choose.
Yeah. So he had basically become your father figure in your life. Today's episode is brought to you by Thrive Marriage Lab. If you want your marriage to thrive, this is a great opportunity to you, because strong marriages are the bedrock of strong churches, organization, families, and community. This is a 12-month pathway for any of you that are looking to really have weekly engagement with experienced marriage counselors. Not just one, but many. So go to restory.life/thrive to get on the waiting list for this great program that starts in April. That's restory.life/thrive. And make sure you put the word Forge in the promo code to receive a discount on your monthly fee. Now, back to the episode. Yeah.
He had, but my dad was still in my life. My dad.
Yeah. Okay.
It's interesting. My dad, I realized after my dad died what a profound influence he had on me, because, and both of them were very, very powerful. My father was very, very stoic.
Mm-hmm.
But he also, one of the things he taught, he loved woodworking. And so when I would go spend time with my dad, which was usually every weekend, every other weekend kind of thing, we would spend the whole weekend just in the wood shop. And we literally wouldn't say much, but I learned all of these things about woodworking, and they're actually kind of life principles that I learned through woodworking. And so, my dad taught me, for instance, whatever you're building, doesn't matter what, the key is the foundation. Right. So if you're building a wall, if you don't put the lower layer of bricks level on a wall, the wall's not going to be level. But if you take the time and do that lower foundation and you do it right, then the following levels will all be level.
Yeah.
And so it was little things like that we used to, he used to just teach me of, if, when I would hammer a nail in and it would go in crooked and I'd end up smashing it into the wood, he'd make me get out a screwdriver and pull it out and pry it out and do it right. So he was very much a very positive influence, as was my mom. All three of them were, but my stepfather was the direct influence on the military. Yeah. Because we used to talk about what is the military and how does it work? And I just assumed, as an 18-year-old kid, we'll have these conversations, but then we never got to really have the conversations. Wow. Because he was never alive when I was doing the Army. Yeah.
So when you really look back and just as a teenager, his influence, what leadership traits have you really received from him? And now you look back and notice as a man.
It's the duty, honor, country kind of piece from West Point of your word is your bond. I remember my mom. I just thought of this. My mom was just the same way, and so I was probably 15. And some friends and I were playing catch with a football at a strip mall. And I threw an errant pass and smashed a sign. And so I go, all right, I'm going to go. And the owner came out and I gave him my name and information. And I was like, whatever, I'll just, no big deal. And I had agreed to pay for it. Huh. So I'm like, yeah, I'll never hear from this guy. And then about a week later, I hear from him, or my mom got a phone call going, your son said he'd pay for this, blah, blah, blah. And so my mom, I come home, she's like, explain what happened, blah, blah, blah. And she said, you're going to pay for it. I said, no, I'm not. And you would have thought then, I crossed the line and it was like that, the hell you will go down there right now and in person and own your responsibility. Wow. And so my parents really, all of them instilled in me the, do the right thing. At my stepfather's funeral, the first time I'd ever heard the cadet prayer from West Point, there's a line in there, make us to choose the harder right instead of the easier wrong, and never be content with a half truth when the whole can be one. And I heard it in that moment at his funeral, and it just stuck with me ever since. And I was like, yeah, that was the path. And I'm not claiming to be this righteous, perfect person, but rather that's been what I've attempted to do. Mm-hmm. And it shows up now, like, on the farm, I'll sell something on Craigslist and it blows me away how many people will say, hey, I'll be by at 4:00 and they don't show up. Mm-hmm. And I go, right? Yeah. And if Army buddy and I were talking about that, about how, no, if I say I'm going to be there at 4:00, I'm going to be there. And if I'm going to be 5 minutes late, I'm going to send you a text going, hey, traffic's worse than I thought. I'll be there at 4:05. Yeah. And those were the kind of things that my parents instilled of doing the harder right instead of the easier wrong, and just standing for something, that there are things more important than the instant gratitude and just doing whatever you want, but rather be a person, a man of your word. And if you say you're going to do it, do it. So I think that's been a huge influence on me.
Yeah. And something distilled at such a young age, because it's just so rare. It's something as a kid, you think it's rare, but then you think adults do it, but most adults don't do it either.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because I think about my teenage years, and I have such amazing memories. And one that just kind of showed up was, so my older brother was dating somebody. And I was a typical snotty teenager, and I said something about her which was not favorable. And I'll just, I don't know if we have to be a G audience. So my brother finds out that I said this, and he's pissed. And we're sitting around. My stepdad's at the table eating breakfast. I'm standing there. My brother comes in and just starts pummeling me,
Right?
Just beating the crap out of me. And he was in Ralph knew what my stepfather knew what was going on. And I looked at him. I said, Ralph, are you not going to do anything? And he said, no, I agree with him.
Yeah.
You're an idiot. You said that. You said those words. You got to pay the price.
Yeah.
And so my brother and I kind of settled, and it was just one of those who was like, look, you're a man. You said those words. I'm not going to bail you out. Yeah. And so that it was just little things like that, another little quick story. I was a teenager and I would go out with my friends at night. And this was back in the days when, we would go out and parents didn't worry about us. And yeah, we were up to no good, but we knew there was boundaries. And curfew was like midnight. I stumble in at 12:30 or 1 o'clock thinking, they'll never know. And there's a yellow legal pad, and it said, to whom it may concern. For those of you who think that you can use this residence as a hotel, you are mistaken. If it happens one is underlined, more time, you will find your shit, and pardon my French, and shit was underlined, in the street when you get home. Sincerely, Ralph B. Garrison Jr. And I was like, he'll do it. I had no doubt that if I showed up at 12:01, the next time I said I'd be home at 12, that I would see him on the front yard taking trash bags of my stuff and throwing it out because of that. This is what you're supposed to do. And I cringe at, and this isn't I'm not getting into the politics or anything, but we're creating generations that people, I feel offended that you looked at me wrong. You know what?
Yeah.
No, we need adults. You and I have talked about, University of Alabama and Nick Saban, the old school coaches that say, no, here's a standard. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to hold you to the standard, not because I'm a jerk, but because I believe you can live up to a standard. And I think that's a missing conversation, is we're creating a victim mindset of, oh, this isn't fair. This isn't. Mm-hmm. No, actually, we need to raise the standard and say, we actually think you can do more.
Yeah.
And I think that my parents really instilled that. And I'm so thankful that was a standard of, I'm going to push you because I care, not because I just want to be a jerk.
Yeah, so. That's there. Yeah, wow. That's Croft. That's really good. Well, one is, I'd hate to give credit to Nick Saban and the Alabama football team, but there is something, we, as someone I respect as just beyond just being an Auburn fan, his leadership abilities, you're right. I think he tells people in the programs, like, if you don't want to be successful in life, then you won't be successful here. Like, he'll tell players coming in, and like that standard of like, you're beyond just a great football player. And
yeah. Well, I either refer to him as Saint Nick or the former Michigan State University.
Yeah, he was. That's right. I forgot.
Yeah, he was back in the
before he found the glory days of the SEC, right?
That's right. Yes.
So Croft, also, with that standard in your home growing up, did that make going in the military that much easier when they had a standard of like, hey?
Yes and no, because what I loved in the military is actually one of the, in some respects, it's so easy to thrive in the military because everything is so black and white.
Right.
I always knew when I needed to be somewhere. I always knew what I needed to wear. I always knew, but the flip side was I knew, and this was one of the reasons I didn't stay for a career. I knew that I would be limited because I couldn't play the game of what success meant in the Army. I was too much of an entrepreneur, too much of a kind of a maverick. I got to do it my own way. And it's interesting because those who know me now, in one respect, like I'm very, the values, the Army and all those things are great. But then those who know me well go, how do you you don't follow rules. You do your own thing. You have to go. And so I struggled because I was kind of swimming upstream all the time. And I was kind of trying to do my own thing. But at the same time, I respected the institution, saw the power of what it stood for, worked for and with amazing people. So, I did well, and I did well enough to I ended up staying another 20 years National Guard and Reserve, and I did well enough to retire. But I knew that, there wasn't going to be stars in my future. I didn't have this bright future as a general officer or somebody that, and I just, and that's one of the reasons I got out. That wasn't the path for me.
Right.
So I chose another, and that was the leadership path was great because it allowed me to understand leadership. But one of the things I learned fairly quickly as I got out of the Army was that is simply one type of leadership. Mm-hmm. It isn't the answer. It's a way of being as a leader that serves you in certain situations. Mm-hmm. But as anything, there's limits to that way of leading. And I don't mean things like integrity and honor and all those things. I think those things are timeless and those will apply anywhere. But I see this a lot. I coach a fair amount of people that have transitioned out of the military, and they have this assessment that what served me in the military, I'll just apply it in the business world and I'll be a success. Yeah. And it's like, no, it's a different ball game. Mm-hmm. And so people sometimes struggle with it. And I think I knew that. So I said, I'm more the path of the entrepreneur doing things my own way.
Right. Which, I do want the title of your book, Leadership Flow, Perfectly Square, a story about learning to lead and transforming a company. So on the backdrop of military being such an influence in your life into leadership, but then also having the independent thought, the entrepreneurial brain applying to leadership and leading and the difference of that into a company. Before we kind of get into that, I'm just curious, as a history buff, who would you say has been a big influence of historical military leaders in your book as well as your own personal leadership?
Well, if I think of famous characters, I have a master's in Civil War history, so I'm pretty nerded out about the Civil War.
You and my dad would have a blast. My dad has a bookshelf of Civil War books.
Yeah. As do I. So I did the math. After I did my master's in Civil War history, I had read in the span of 2 years, or less than 2 years, 90 different books. Had written, over 900 pages on military history. And the irony is I have not picked up a single Civil War book since then, but loved that. Very influenced. Two people, I think. One is Joshua Chamberlain, who commanded the 20th Maine at the Battle of Gettysburg, and Little Round Top, and kind of saved the day, and ended up being battlefield promotion to brigadier general because Grant thought he was going to die, and then brevet promotion, I think, to major general, and he was the person accepting Lee's formal surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Very interesting. Man, professor of theology and rhetoric at Bowdoin College in Maine, and just a kind of a Renaissance type person. Was a college professor and really wanted to join the Union Army. They wouldn't let him. They said, "How about we'll give you a year sabbatical and you can go to Europe?" He said, "Great, I'll take it," and went and joined the Army, and then went from there. So the other one that I'm a big fan of is Grant. Just because so many things about him, but he just fundamentally was like, just go, don't ever stop. Mm-hmm. He would never, some of my favorite things, one of him, he was known for his ability to be clear and succinct in his orders. And so I remember one of his quotes was to General Meade when he took command. He said, "Where Lee's army goes, there you will go also." Yeah. And that was pretty much how Meade did it. Just you follow Lee. Mm-hmm. But he would do things like he would never backtrack. So if he was on a horse and he got lost, he wouldn't retrace his steps. He would just keep going forward, kind of thing. Yeah. So very much both of them were very big. I'm a big fan of Patton. Yeah. Just because I was a tanker, an armor officer, and Patton's flamboyance and all those things. Bradley, Eisenhower from a understanding the role of a political officer, mm-hmm. Having to manage that. And then a real big fan of George Marshall. So, and he was the chief of staff of the Army during World War II. Yeah. And really was kind of considered the indispensable person. Mm-hmm. He had the opportunity. Roosevelt came to him and basically said, "Do you want to command the forces for D-Day?" Mm-hmm. And his response was something to the effect of, "Sir, that's not my decision. That's your decision." and whatever you tell me to do, I'll do. Knowing full well that whoever was going to command D-Day was going to go down much more in history than whoever was the chief of staff in the Army. But what ended up happening was so many senators and key people in Washington said, no, he needs to be here because he's that influential. So,
wow.
Those are all,
yeah.
when you geek out about military history, that kind of stuff. So,
which I could, one of my favorite biographies was Patton after I read the book, and just some of his quotes, how real they really were in the movie.
I think I can relate to Patton. One of my favorite quotes about Patton was a fitness report on him in the 30s was something like this. It was, this man will be completely invaluable in war, but quite frankly, he scares me in peacetime. Right. And Patton was such a great example. I mean, he was, the whole reincarnation, the chivalry, wrote poetry, wanted to duel Rommel in the desert, all that stuff. But somebody like him struggled in many respects in the peacetime army.
He went in depression between the two world wars. Yeah. Had multiple affairs.
All of those. He was Patton. And then, and it was interesting, our place in history is sometimes determined by when we die. And so, at the end of, it was December 21st. I know that because it was my birthday, 1945, not the day I was born, but that's the day he died. And so he had the ability to do this
car
great
accident
thing.
too, right?
Yeah. And then a car accident and broke his neck.
Irony
And
of
then he
that.
lived, I think about, So,
Yeah, and you're right. And he was already creating conflict in just the 6 months of peace.
Yeah, well, let's go kick Stalin's tail, and let's go fight the Russians while we got the army to do it. Yeah, and you could make the argument that, well, there was legitimacy there, that we're seeing what happens when tyranny isn't opposed, and the Cold War on up to today, we're still feeling the effects of the Russian mindset. So
absolutely. Oh man, I could sit here and geek out with you, Croft, all day on that, of just even Civil War history, and I could hear your Union side as a Southerner who, my bookshelf, not many people.
Well, this, I will tell you, Lee's I'm a big fan of Lee. Stonewall Jackson, I love. Nathan Bedford Forrest is a super interesting, not politically correct to be a fan of Forrest, but I learned as a historian, I'm not judging it as, what is contemporary thinking. You have to look at history in the eyes and in the span of when it was. Forrest was just scared, rose from the rank of private to major or lieutenant general in the Confederate Army. Stonewall Jackson, probably my favorite Confederate general, and very quirky, but when he put his mind to something, he was, super interesting. So I still have
they still study his tactics at West Point, don't they? I mean,
they do. I don't know if they do Jackson, but I mean, the whole thing is still very studied, unless we've made it politically incorrect to do. But, so that was such an easy subject to study because it's so interesting and there's so many ways to look at it. And I remember when I was doing my master's, at one point I was reading 4 biographies at a time because the class I was taking was Ulysses S. Grant and his lieutenants. So I was reading the war through Grant and his 3 main subordinates. As the war unfolded, I would read chapters in each and just inch along during the war. So such an interesting subject to study. So
really is. I won't waste most of your time on that but I'm a very curious person related to that language or that in that time as well. But you're a military reserve. I know you probably did other things, but what really got you into really focusing on leadership, specifically in business, and why leadership is so important in business?
So I got out of the Army, and then what do I want to do with my life? And that question of what is leadership came up again. So luckily here in Albuquerque, I stumbled into a boutique, medium to small size leadership and change coaching and consulting firm. And I was hired as a quote unquote coach. And the they had just signed a huge contract with an underground palladium and platinum mine in Montana. So I was hired to go coach frontline supervisors.
Huh.
And the good news was being underground in a palladium and platinum mine isn't really that much different than being in the field in the Army. Lots of big, dangerous equipment. You have to wear protective gear, harsh conditions, the mindset you've got to always be going and all that. So I really kind of took to it and had some success. I had read Tony Robbins. I had read Zig Ziglar, so I was into self-help. And at the time I was reading, I went through, I don't know, probably 10 years where I was trying to read 50 books a year. And I would literally just every week, and it was almost always on leadership, history, whatever the case may be. And so after about 2 or 3 years, I had about 600 hours of coaching under my belt and said, you know what, I think I want to get certified as a coach. And so this is the early 2000s. Coaching is just becoming a little bit more mainstream, a little more acceptable. So started looking around. Because I was in the Army Reserve, the Army basically said, look, we'll pay for it as long as it's with a university. And stumbled into an organization called the Newfield Network. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Because that year, Newfield did a program with Villanova University's Executive Education Department. And they had this leadership and coaching program. And it was in what's called ontological coaching. And I'll talk about that in just a second. And it worked out great because it was over 2 fiscal years. The Army said, yep, we'll pay this part. We'll pay this part. They'll pay for the whole thing. So I went to Newfield in Villanova to become a coach. But the reality was I was actually not, I was just going to check the block. Because in my mind, I was a captain of the United States Army. And look, if any institution owns leadership, it's the United States Army. I mean, after all, we kind of invented it, and you could go through all the leaders. So I'll go, I'll put in my time, I'll check the block, but I just really want to get the certification. And I knew that I was like, look, it's, not a big deal. It's 3 long weekends over the span of a year and then in between. So I walked in, and this is an organization called the Newfield Network out of Boulder, Colorado. And I literally look around and I'm going, what the heck did I get myself into? And there's all these people, it seems like they're dancing and they're so happy and, oh, this is great and all these things. And I literally thought about, this is going to be a waste of my time. But I knew, 1, I just want to get through the program for the certification. And 2, because the Army is paying for it, it's going to be easier to just do it than have to explain why I dropped out. So there were a few other people that had that same look of disbelief on their face. And I thought, okay, we'll hang out. Well, the second day shows up and those people are gone. They flat out said, this is wackadoodle. I'm out of here. So Newfield is founded by a man named Julio Alaya. So if you ever get a chance, just look on YouTube for Julio Alaya, Ollalla, a Chilean lawyer who grew up in Chile in the Pinochet regime and fled to the U.S. and did a lot of deep research with other very smart people. And they looked into this idea, and Newfield was chosen as a new field of coaching. And it looked at the idea of, and I'll explain a little bit, what we call the observer. And so I remember I was on day 2, and one of the things in ontological coaching is we look at the body. And I remember sitting there and my body was numb. And it was kind of tingling, and it was numb, not like it couldn't feel, but it was numb like there was starting to feel. And I remember saying to myself, I don't know what this is, but I need to be here. And so ended up through the course, and people would say, well, how was Newfield? And I'd say, oh, it was amazing. And they'd say, well, what was it about? And I'd say, I have no idea. Because it was too far out there. Right. But I'll explain it and try to put it into context. So the idea of ontological coaching, ontology is the study of being human. So 2 models to kind of put that in perspective. The first is what we call the OAR model. The A stands for action, R stands for result. So as human beings, we take actions, we get results, right? So a simple example, let's say you said, I want to run a marathon. Great, not a problem. Here's a 6-month training plan. Week 1, you run 10 miles. Week 2, you run 12 miles, and so on and so forth. And in 6 months, you run a marathon. And that works unless it doesn't work. Right? Because if it was that easy, all I'd have to do is just go get a book and read it. No, I've got 6-pack abs. just go get a book. I got a great relationship. Oh, I'm a great leader because I read a book, right? Mm-hmm. But what it doesn't take into account is the O in the OAR model, which is what we call the observer. How I observe something determines what actions I see, what results I get, right? So using the running analogy, if I hate running and it's Monday morning at 5:00 and today I'm supposed to start day one of my 6-month training plan, I'm going to roll over in bed and go, I don't want to get out of bed. Mm-hmm. I don't see many actions to take and I'm not going to see the results. Conversely, you or your listeners probably all know somebody who running is life. Mm-hmm. And it's snowing outside and they're excited because they're going to run 12 miles, right? Yeah. That's a different observer. So the idea is first order learning in transactional coaching goes, if I'm going to coach you, I'm just going to give you new actions to take. Yeah. And that's great if it works. But the problem is if we don't shift the observer, those actions probably won't happen. So we call this second order learning. If I shift my observer, now I open up far more actions I can take because using the running analogy, I want to run now. Right. Well, the way I have to do it is I have to find a way of looking at it so that I go, yes, that takes care of what I care about. Mm-hmm. So then we look at what makes us a human being. What are these 5 things? And for me, when I learned this, when I finally started getting it, it goes back to that fundamental question of what is leadership. I realized I could start to see leadership. Right. So these 5 things are simply this. And it's simple, but it's very complex. The first is, as human beings, we are historical beings. So as humans, we see the world not as it is. We see the world as our history taught us it is. Yeah. So you and I both see the world. We both have lived in Alabama. Mm-hmm. Right. So we've both been in Alabama. So we can see the world from that perspective. The flip side is we've never lived in Uganda. So how can I see the world from that perspective if I haven't? So that idea, we look at history not as a right or wrong or good or bad, but simply to provide context. Mm-hmm. That's the observer I am. And the observer I am, based on my history, determines what I can and can't see. So we're historical beings. The second thing we look at is human beings, we are linguistic beings. We live in language. Right? So think about language. Language is the fundamental human technology. Mm-hmm. A baby's born and it has one tool. Cry. That one tool is the ability to cry, right? Mm-hmm. But crying turns into syllables. Mm-hmm. Syllables turn into words. Words turn into sentences, and sentences turn into conversation. Mm-hmm. So it's through conversation that as human beings, we coordinate action. You and I are talking at this moment because of a conversation we had. Now that could take many forms, email, conversation, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But we look at 2 aspects in language because there's 2 distinct things we want to look at. The first is we look at the phenomenon of language. Because language, actually, if you think about it, you went to school, you learned how to conjugate verbs and write sentences. But what you probably didn't learn is that there's basically only about 6 things we can do in language. Yeah. Declarations, offers, requests, promises, assertions, and assessments. All of those pieces go together to form conversation. So we look at the phenomenon because language isn't just descriptive, it's generative, right? If you and I want to create a future tomorrow, I can make a request. I can go, hey, you want to go for lunch tomorrow? Sure. You say yes, that's a declaration. That opens up a new future that wasn't going to happen today. But now that can happen in the future. So we look at that. But then the second thing we look at is that as human beings, we make meaning in language. We live our life in stories. Huh. You and I can go to a meeting, see the exact same thing, and you walk out going, oh, that meeting was awesome. I walk out, oh, that meeting sucked. Yeah. We have different stories, right? We're describing them as if they're real. Mm-hmm. That meeting was rotten. That's what I think is real. But that's actually just my interpretation, my story, based on my history and then the other factors I'm going to talk about. Mm-hmm. So we're historical beings, we're linguistic beings. The third thing we look at as human beings, we are emotional beings. Yeah. We are always in some mood or emotional state, and we look at moods and emotions as a predisposition to action. So if you think about this, every day as human beings, there are literally millions and millions of data points coming at us. So I walk outside, there's a bird, that's a data point. There's a tree, that's a data point. There's a car, all these data points. We need a way to make sense of all this data. And the way we do it as human beings is we use emotions, right? So if I walk out of my house and I see a car barreling down the road and I see my daughter in the driveway in that path, I am going to have a strong emotional response to take action, right? A predisposition to action. Mm-hmm. The thing about moods and emotions, though, most of us are blind to them. Mm-hmm. And we see them, they perpetuate a story. Fine example, we just went through this thing called the pandemic. Never once did I see Fox or CNN go, look at the mood and emotion we're in. Mm-hmm. We didn't. We lived them as, look at the facts we're in.
Right.
Right? Mm-hmm. And look at all those facts that were stories. Oh, mask save. Oh, mask are a joke. Whatever it is. Story. Mm-hmm. We never acknowledge we're in an emotional state.
Yeah.
I predict there will actually be people that will wear masks for the rest of their lives. Yeah. Because they've created a mood that the world is a dangerous place. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm not judging. I'm just simply saying that's the power of moods. And mm-hmm. most of them they're so subtle because that's the world we live in. Mm-hmm. So we're historical, we're linguistic, we're emotional. The fourth thing we look at as human beings, we are somatic. We live in bodies. The body, we are not brains on a stick, right? The body is actually the domain of action. So any action you take, you're taking on, or you're writing, that's the body. You're listening, that's the body. You're speaking, that's the body. You're walking, that's the body. So the body is a domain of action. But as human beings, we cannot do what we physically cannot do. Mm-hmm. So if you and I need to have an open conversation, but my body is closed, we can't actually have an open conversation. Mm-hmm. So we look at the body to see, what's the literal shape of the body? Mm-hmm. And for me, this was a huge place to learn, and I still am working on it because, for instance, I learned in the Army to have a mask. So when it gets tough, you grit your teeth, you focus, right? Mm-hmm. That serves you. But the problem is, if that's how I always see things, now I'm limited. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So those four things. And then the fifth thing we look at as human beings, we are our practices. What we practice, we become good at, right? And if you think about it, I'm going to ask you a question, and I think I know the answer. Do you brush your teeth?
Yes.
Yes. Right? And I know you do because all your teeth are there. Mm-hmm. And I bet you practice every day, at least twice a day. Mm-hmm. Now, the good news is you're practicing, but if I ask your dentist might say, well, Carl, you might want to brush a little bit longer. Yeah. Or you might be missing a spot, right? But you've been practicing that. So things that we practice writing, we practice reading, we practice walking, we practice talking. So that serves us, but we may also be practicing things like ineffective emotions. So I'm in a mood of resignation, and I've actually been practicing it. Mm-hmm. And anytime something happens, my body goes, I know that, get in that emotion. That's how we'll see it. Right. So all those things, I know this is kind of long-winded, all those things become the observer. The beauty is if I want to shift the observer, I can fundamentally do it in three domains. I can shift the story, language. I can shift the moods and emotions, or I can shift the body. So a lot of what I do, now go back to that original question that I started when I was 8 years old. Mm-hmm. Now I could see leadership because I could start to go, that leader walks in a room in this body. Now I can start to observe what's possible. They're open. Now we can have open conversations. They're closed. We're not having that conversation. Mm-hmm. A leader walks in a mood of resentment or frustration. Mm-hmm. That creates different conversations. Language has an effect on people in their bodies. Yeah. So for me, this was like when I really started to get it, I was like, oh my God, this leadership thing, I could look at somebody like a Patton or whomever, and I could start to see oh, this is what they do effectively. This is where they struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I'm coaching, fast forward today, when I'm coaching somebody, a lot of what we look at is, what is your observer?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because how are you observing that thing? So you say you want to get in shape, but the observer you have a story that working out's pain. Mm-hmm. Your body doesn't respond to it. You're an emotion of resignation around working out. If we shift those, mm-hmm. we can make change. A simple example you may see is usually around the first of the year, or you'll see it other times in a gym, when somebody had a significant emotional event like a heart attack. Mm-hmm. You'll see the person that all of a sudden now I go, ooh, this is legit. I better make some change.
Yeah.
But I see people also that show up to the gym. The doctor said, you've got to, because you had a heart attack, and they go up and they show up to the gym and they talk to people for the whole 2 hours because they haven't shifted their observer on what health means. So we can explore all those things. And that's how all of this then came to, go from Army leader to this to now as I coach. That's where I spend a lot of my time with, what is the person's observer? How are they seeing it? And then where do we go with that?
That's interesting. There's so much. I mean, you unloaded on me, which was beautiful, Croft. Yeah. I mean, just even the historical, though. I mean, the things to change that you said is story, emotion, and body. How we change those, and it's interesting. My listeners have heard me say this way too many times, but it is so key. And I think, especially at a young age, I left Alabama, moved to California for 5 years, and the difference of, like you said, story, but even I felt like history anyway, but there was a different being. My body was in a different place, people speaking a different language, even though it was mm-hmm. English, right? But even like seeing people where I had similar values, but they didn't look like the people I grew up with. Mm-hmm. So I'm
all
just
those
curious.
Things come into play. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how much is a human being in that observer state is exposure to new experiences, new people, new ideas help that?
Well, we would make the argument that I think I would make the argument that, first of all, we have to have histories. Yeah. We have to have a physical shape, because I can't be everything. Yes. So we start the moment we're born. If you think about a baby when it's born, mm-hmm. it's literally just a slug. Mm-hmm. But it learns certain things. So it picks up a block, and maybe it's an environment that's rewarded. Do more. And so it does that. But maybe it's an environment that, don't do that. And the body shrinks. Yeah. And then it learns, I'm going to be small in this world. Mm. So then we go through, and now events come into our lives, new paths, new people, trauma, and how we respond. Yes. Trauma is huge. Mm-hmm. I think most kind of thinking around this now is that we're shaped by our traumas mm-hmm. all the time. Yeah. But we don't know that. You think about the person that, like, we learned something as a kid because one of our parents says something offhanded, don't do that. Only stupid people do that. Mm-hmm. And then that becomes truth. Go back to speech acts. One of them is what we call an assessment. Assessment is not a fact. It's an opinion. But what can happen is we look at assessments as a fact, mm-hmm. right? I'll give you an example, not getting into politics. I had a neighbor that when Donald Trump was elected, she literally didn't leave her house for 90 days because the assessment she was living in is that the world was falling. Mm-hmm. And that's all she could see. Right. And I'm sure there are people that saw that when Joe Biden was elected, all that stuff. Right. So so we're all of these things. And where I think is so powerful, most of us go through it. Well, most people I assess go through it. They're blind to it because I go back. Right. I didn't know what the body doesn't matter in leadership. Mm-hmm. What the hell does that matter? Mm-hmm. Now I see, oh my God, it's everything. It's the Holy Grail. Right. Because if I can shift my body and be open, now I can have a conversation. Mm-hmm. So for me, what's been so powerful about this journey is that awareness that, I don't see the world as it is. Mm-hmm. I see the world as I am. Right. Yeah. So the whole pandemic actually wasn't what it was. It was how individuals saw it. And then collectively, that's how we saw it. Right. But most people I assess are blind to the phenomenon.
Yeah, it's crazy. And so, I mean, being that this is the Men Are Forged podcast, how much are men therefore influenced by other men, especially older men?
Well, it all goes back to the whole observer, right? So I could have just as easily resisted my stepfather. I could have just as easily said, I'm not following that path. Now, I don't know why I did what I did, but I responded to it. Right. So you'll see people that will grow up in a household and, they're a year apart. They literally had identical childhoods, and yet they're two different directions.
Yeah.
We don't know why, but I would assess that men are shaped, and anyone is shaped by the stories they tell, the moods and emotions they live in, and in the body. So one of the things I didn't talk about, I've done a lot of deep dive into somatics, the study of being in the body. One of my main teachers is a gentleman named Richard Strozzi Heckler. And Richard's just a guru with this stuff. He 7th level Dan in Aikido, literally has a leadership dojo in the mountains of Northern California, where you don't go to talk about leadership, you experience it in your body. And so we practice being in our bodies around leadership. And for most people, we're blind to that. We just think, oh, this is the body I'm in. But we don't realize that if we go back to the body, moods, and emotions language, we can't actually separate them. See, I can't have an emotion, because to have an emotion, I have to have a body that's in that shape. So real quick, if I said something to you that was shocking, your body would do something like this, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Which is a universal human thing. And what's happening is your eyes open, your observer goes, there's data here I cannot comprehend. And I assess it's dangerous. Pull that body back to expand the horizon, open the eyes, get air in the system, and prepare to possibly have to take massive action.
Right.
So I can't separate those, because all of that happens in a millisecond. And we have a story, we have moods and emotions, we have a body. The beautiful thing, though, is I can coach to any one of the three. So if somebody's in a big breakdown, I can say, we can look at it linguistically. What's your story? We can explore the moods and emotions, predisposition to action, or we can explore the body. And usually we do some combination of all those three.
Yeah, that's great. So so I guess, this is the kind of last real question here, Croft, is, so how do you now, I mean, you kind of just mentioned that. So what is that? How did that lead to what you're doing now? And how, where do you see that most in what you're doing? Is that in leaders in business? Is that in leaders in certain types of industries, or even outside of the business world?
So it shows up in everybody that's human.
Yeah.
So I coach literally from individual contributors to very, very high ranking government officials in both the government and the military.
Okay.
And to the same thing in business. All of them are observers.
Right.
All of them have bodies, all of them have stories, all of them. So what I love about it is it doesn't matter who the person is. What I have worked very hard is to understand or be able to look at how they're observing it, not to judge, but rather to go, oh, they're seeing X, but they're saying they want to see Y. Then I can help them see, oh, you see how you say you want Y, but you're actually focusing on X.
Right.
And then we can explore it in the body, the moods and emotions, the language, however we do that.
And you generally do that through one-on-one coaching. Is that?
Yes, but I do also a lot of, in organizations, we'll do, like right now I'm working with an executive team of a manufacturing company. So we'll do that. The team, we're collectively going through, starting this idea of it, helping them understand how they are as individual observers and then collective observers.
Yeah. And so this is another, I said that was my last question, but I do that one more.
That's right.
I think what's fascinating is how much influence a leader has on the culture. And so the leader as an observer, how important is that, and why is that so? I mean, you kind of already hit on that, but I'm just fascinated.
I actually think that's the main thing, because the leader, a definition we use for my discourse is politics is the conversations about who gets to have which and what conversations. Well, the leader determines what conversations we have. The leader determines what moods and emotions we have. So the leader then, whether it's a family, a business, a church, it doesn't matter how the leader shows up. And all you have to do is look at, the United States under Donald Trump was a different country than it is under Joe Biden. Now, I didn't say which is better, which is worse, but I bet I could get people to agree that it's different.
Right.
And it's different because those leaders show up with different moods and emotions, different stories. They have different conversations. They say, here's what we're going to focus on. Yep. So leaders are absolutely critical. Even if I'm a leader and I let the culture run me over, I'm still determining it because I actually could change and say, I want to have a different conversation. But many times leaders don't have that skill because go back to practice. I haven't practiced on how to have that conversation. So most leaders are blind to what's going on because they're so indoctrinated into their way of observing that they don't have the ability to go, wait a second, we're missing some conversations.
And that is, is that the rub you're feeling when you're coaching a leader, is helping them to engage and to understand that someone has a different observer than they do?
Yeah, and just yes, having them you're an observer, they're an observer. You see this. All you have to do is go on Facebook, and my candidate is the greatest thing since sliced bread. No, your candidate's a idiot. That's not going to work, right? So we have to be aware of, this is my observer, this is your observer, and then when we start getting into business or teams, what is the shared outcome that we want to commit to?
Yeah.
But we can't force. See, I can't force. A real quick example. I can't force you to be committed to something. And the best example I can think of is masks. How effective is it to have a mandate around masks? Doesn't work. Now, some people will be committed to it, but there were a lot of people that said, the heck I will.
Right.
Because we didn't actually have a shared commitment.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
We had two different views that, this is what the future holds. And half said, the heck it does. I'm not doing that future. And then that's where we're at right now is we don't have a shared commitment. So, for all the political stuff that people say, it isn't going to be until a leader can say, here's a future that we can all agree to and commit to, which is impossible, by the way, because not everybody's going to agree to it. But effective leaders tend to find something that we can all at least get on board with.
Yes. And that's what you would say, the common thread of all good leaders that or have studied. That's generally what they do.
Yes, but remember, the one thing that I think is different in whether it's a military or an organization is it's not a complete democracy. See, one of the things I think I rail against current leadership thought is we've got to be servants and make everybody happy. That doesn't work. The leader's role is to get people committed to a future that takes care of what the organization is committed to. And so you may not like it, but can I get you committed to producing the results? Right? Go back to, I would assess, we talked about Nick Saban, I would assess he's a very effective executive as evidenced by, I can see the end result. On the field, they do what they say they're going to do. And that's not for everybody. There are people that leave, say, I'm not playing. And he says, fine, go. If you're going to be in this organization, this is the commitment we're going to commit to.
Right.
And that's where he then goes and great coaches, great leaders have that ability, but they're not there to be liked. And I think one of the things we've created in leadership is, you've got to be this all-inclusive, everybody like you leader. No, it's not going to work.
That is interesting because you talked about body just being open to conversation. And that is not necessarily being liked, but that's just being open.
Well, and I can say, no, that's not a conversation I'm going to have.
Yeah.
Right. So if I showed up with Nick Saban, hey, I think you should let me be a starting quarterback. No, that's not a conversation we're going to have, Croft.
Yeah. There's going to be a scout.
Now, I may not like it. Yeah. No matter what. No, that's not a conversation we're going to have. So it isn't, open may serve in the moment. If I truly want to hear what people, yes, but I don't always have to be open as a leader.
Right.
Because I'm committed. Here's the outcome. And I don't want to hear what you have to say.
Yes. And I think at the end of the day, even the people that don't agree with that, there's still people that are attracted to conviction of this is what we're about and this is what we're doing. Yeah. So that's
real quick, I use the example of George Bush right after 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, if you look right after 9/11, he basically said, you guys pissed off the wrong cowboy. We're coming after you.
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment, most people were committed. 7 years later, a lot of people weren't as committed because they go, no, maybe we changed. But he pretty much, whether you agree or not, I think he pretty much, this is where I stand.
Yeah.
So, and leadership is not a popularity contest. And that's why political leadership, don't even get me started on that. Right?
Just turns gross. That's what it does.
Yeah. Because the goal of the leader is to get elected, not to stand up for what we assess is right and go the direction. So.
Right. Which is what, we've all just history. We've not been voting for policies. We've been voting for a narrative and
especially in the modern world, is the image as opposed to, go back to the Lincolns and the Washingtons, what is the character and where do they actually stand?
Right. Yeah. TV media really affected that, didn't it? Yeah. The story was being told, right?
Yes. Yep. And it is a story.
Yeah. Well, Croft, I appreciate you coming on. Is there a place where people can find you, follow you, or buy your book?
Well, I think like you and I both have very unique names.
Yeah.
So the good news is all you got to do is Google Croft Edwards, and I'm pretty much number one on the list.
Yeah.
My website is croftandcompany.com.
Mm-hmm.
And then my book is LeadershipFlow Perfectly Square. You can find that at Amazon, where all those different places. Mm-hmm. And but I'm fairly easy to connect with, and love to connect on LinkedIn. And pretty much LinkedIn and Twitter are the only places you can find me.
Great. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Croft. It was a fascinating discussion. So
anytime, Carl. Great time, and War Eagle.
War Eagle. All right, one more thing before you go, guys. If you are that guy sitting there like, what the heck am I doing in my life? Or heck, you have done all the things you're supposed to do and you are bored with your life, I've been there, done that. I want you to go to mentorforge.com/define your purpose. This is why I do what I do. I'm trying to help you get unstuck, move past restlessness and even hopelessness, and dive into that next phase of your life. Get excited about your life. Be excited about what you've already been through and where you're going. So go to mentorforge.com/define your purpose. It's a 4-session coaching program. And the first one is free. So go to mentorforge.com/define your purpose. And I look forward to hearing from you.